Blood-pumping action, a story-driven adventure, and enough magic to put Merlin to shame. My name is Codiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and today we have the special privilege to share our brutally honest impressions of Ascendant Studios' upcoming first-person magic shooter, Immortals of Aveum. I want to start by saying a huge thank you to EA for flying me out to California to check out Immortals of Aveum. Alongside a bunch of fellow creators, I had the opportunity to go hands-on with the game for a few hours. During the test, I had access to multiple levels, got the chance to fight a few bosses, and was able to explore much of the game's systems without any sort of restrictions. It was a pretty unfiltered look at a new game with a lot of potential, so let's dive in and take a look. Immortals of Aveum is a pretty classic tale of good versus evil, at least at the onset. We got a more clear picture of that during our hands-on preview. You play as Jack, a Triarch capable of wielding 3 schools of magic, blue, red, and green. Being a Triarch is special in the game because most Magnus, the name for magic users, only have access to 1 school of magic. Throughout my roughly 3 hours of game time with Immortals, it became clear that Brett Robbins' Call of Duty background was a major influence on the narrative. Brett, who's leading development of Immortals of Aveum, also held multiple creative roles during his time at Sledgehammer Games on the cutting edge of releases like Call of Duty World War II, Advanced Warfare, and Modern Warfare 3. It's an accessible story, one I won't spoil in any way here, with some strong voice acting, but less than nuanced writing.
Something funny?
You walk towards your doom.
Doom and I are old friends.
Phrases like "the jury's still out" and other corny phrases like that, I think try to present the game and its characters like normal people just trapped in a magical war. But once you start slinging spells and fighting dragons, it's pretty hard to believe this is anything but fantasy. What I will say about the story, though, is that it is omnipresent to the action. Oftentimes, the team offers up small cinematic moments within missions and usually rounds out a level with a larger, more purposeful cinematic that helps drive the story forward. Again, this is Robbins' experience with major AAA titles in full effect, and for me, it works. These moments of storytelling offer a nice break from the action, which can often be a bit overwhelming. I'm hopeful that the story will evolve beyond the boilerplate good guys versus bad guys setup, but at this point, it's way too early to tell. Where Immortals of Aveum truly shines is in its combat. Trailers don't do the game justice, and it wasn't until I went hands-on with the title that I appreciated just how fast and chaotic the action could be. For my playthrough, I chose to subject myself to the hardest difficulty available, Immortal, knowing nothing about how that would change my experience, but I can say without question that I made the right choice. Much like any other FPS, there is a pure joy that comes with managing the chaos of a firefight, and since this isn't a traditional military shooter where enemies shoot out from behind cover, you're forced to adapt to a different pace, one where there's constant pressure on you to deal with enemies that are rapidly approaching. In that sense, Immortals feels like a boomer shooter, like a variation on the Doom model. If you like that sort of chaos in your FPS games, then you'll be right at home. I mentioned those 3 schools of magic before, blue, red, and green, and I think it's best we talk about them for a few minutes. Each color of magic excels at a different part of combat. Blue spells are like rifles, they're more accurate, deal high damage, and have a decent range. Red spells are your shotguns and explosive spells. They deal extremely high damage at range, usually have some element of AoE and knockback, but suffer when fighting anything more than a handful of steps away. Finally, there's green magic, which I can only really parallel to automatic weapons with a homing component. Usually, the various green magic sigils, i.e. weapons, have lower damage but higher capacity and fire rate. I actually found that green magic was one of my favorite to use because it's a nice solution to the frenetic action of combat. The slight homing element that is fundamental to green magic attacks gives you a little wiggle room when trying to aim at various enemies you're trying to attack, and unless you have pinpoint accuracy under pressure, it's a nice way to build a little forgiveness for more casual players. What I really wasn't expecting was how the various sigils changed the way Jack could engage with combat. Just like weapons in a military-style shooter, sigils each have their own unique identity, and thus, when you change a sigil, you now have access to a completely different type of weapon. If you strip it back to the absolute foundation, the developers can use sigils to manipulate the basics, such as damage, range, and capacity. But because of the magical nature of the game, there's some freedom to do things a bit differently. The one sigil that stands out in my mind that I had access to is the Javelin, which acts as a vehicle to deliver highly precise and lethal blue magic. Unlike a traditional sniper rifle, with this sigil equipped, Jack can charge up an attack that also zooms in as it's being charged. When released, a bolt of blue magic rips across the map, usually killing whatever target it hits. It's an interesting way to add a bit of depth to the combat. Because the game encourages you to cycle between your 3 schools of magic, it's necessary to build out a well-rounded kit that allows you to deal with all types of combat situations. Where this gets a bit more interesting is with the introduction of totems. We saw the Lash showcased quite a bit during the first gameplay trailer, and going hands-on with it confirmed what I suspected, that it's a fairly straightforward but satisfying thing to wield. Really, it's another tool in your tool chest, but when evil magic archers are shooting you from across the map, it's nice to have the option to lash them closer and rip them apart with your own attacks. During the hands-on preview, I also obtained the Green Vial, which gave me access to limpets, a sort of green goop that, when attached to something, slows them down, and the Red Lens, which opens up the ability to disrupt enemies, stunning them in place. I'll be honest, I didn't get to a point where I was really weaving these secondary systems into my combat, but I could see their value. The team even doubles down on these within the talent system, something we'll talk about shortly. Walking away from the preview event, I was really impressed with the combat overall. The action is lightning fast, but it's also responsive, and being on a mouse and keyboard, I felt right at home with the experience, and after just a little practice, I could command Jack with relative ease. What's really fun is the flexibility of so many weapons on hand, and unlike the holstering and drawing of different firearms in more traditional shooters, you can flip between your sigils with almost no delay, which means you can quickly adapt to whatever enemy is in your way, and you'll need those options because enemies do come in a variety of shapes and sizes. If there was one thing about the combat I struggled with, it was the overall ability to see. The flashing bits and bobs of your spells mixed with incoming enemy attacks makes it nearly impossible to see the world around you, and this often meant tracking enemies was a real pain. I know not everyone likes enemy outlines and things of that nature, but on more than one occasion, in fact pretty often, I would completely lose track of an enemy because of just how much stuff was on my screen. Hopefully there are some accessibility options to address this, but with my limited time, I didn't have the chance to really explore the menus in depth. One thing I was not expecting to test out were the game's progression systems. Usually those sorts of things are under wraps until launch, but the Ascendant team is clearly confident in their game because everyone at the preview event had a decent amount of freedom to explore some of the integral systems that would ultimately determine Jack's power. Because I alluded to it before, we'll start with the Forge. This is a rather straightforward crafting and salvaging system that allows you to craft, upgrade, and deconstruct items that you own. Because we were jumped around in the playthrough, I don't know exactly how crafting recipes are unlocked, but I did have a couple of options for each colored sigil. Crafting an item requires gold and essence, both of which you pick up by defeating enemies, busting open boxes, and finding chests. It's a simple system, but does give you access to those different types of weapons we talked about before. The menu also hints at something called Legendary Essence, which piqued my interest, but that's not something we had access to during the preview. Upgrades are again a straightforward system. For some gold and essence, you can increase the stats of a sigil. If you've watched any of our previous reviews or impressions, you know that these types of linear power curve systems do nothing for me, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. Apply an upgrade and the damage stat ticks up. Does it make for a more powerful weapon? Sure, but does it add anything remotely meaningful to the experience? Not at all. To cap it off, the Forge also has a deconstruct component which simply allows you to take the items you no longer want or need and break them down for gold and essence. I do think it's important they added this system because a bunch of sigils and gear sitting in your bags would have been a real waste. It's not a notable system, but a necessary one given the nature of crafting and upgrading gear. What was a bit more interesting, at least to me, was the talent system. Again, if you know me, then you know I'm looking for nodes that fundamentally change the nature of the game and the action, and Immortals of Aveum does feature a healthy mix of stat increases and combat-changing talents. Talents can be allocated to enhance each of the 3 schools of magic, but within those trees are hybrid nodes which require you to have certain prerequisites within other colors. For example, something like Blue Core requires you to have 4 red talents before you can spec into it. But once you do, it adds a knockback component to your shield, combining elements of red and blue magic. These hybrid talents are echoed in the other trees as well, and I believe will inject enough change into the combat to be noticeable, which is what I'm looking for in a system like this. As I mentioned before, totems can also be enhanced via the talent system, and I was actually a bit surprised by that. In my mind, before going hands-on, the lash was a lash, a tool and nothing more. But by giving the player the ability to upgrade these totems, it allows them to play a bigger role in the gameplay experience. Obviously, in my short playthrough, I didn't have enough points to really test the limits of this system, but I've seen enough talent trees to know when and what is required to create something meaningful and impactful, and I believe this will do the trick. It's not the most intricate talent system out there, but it fits the bill. Because of the linear nature of the game, and at this point the lack of any clear replayability value, I would say players won't be able to unlock every node and become an unstoppable Triarch, at least during story progression. Luckily, you can respec at any time, and while I don't love that there's a cost associated with this, at least it's an option. As I wrapped up my play session and walked out the door, I have to say I was impressed with the game. Immortals of Aveum takes the familiar FPS formula and infuses the genre with high fantasy and magic, and so far that experiment works. As I've said a few times throughout this video, the combat is lightning quick, and playing on the hardest difficulty is no walk in the park, but there's a satisfaction that comes with wiping out an entire area of enemies utilizing the various weapons at your disposal. I'm not really sold on the forge system yet, crafting and upgrading weapons. It's nice to have options, but in a story-driven game, I think I would have preferred those options to come via progression. Again, I'm not rendering full judgment as this was just a preview, but I can see the writing on the wall. What I am most anxious to experience further is the story. The visuals and voice acting are all solid, but the writing left me a bit lukewarm. In just a handful of cinematics I got to experience, the B-grade action movie writing just didn't line up with the rest of the setting, and it was clear this could be the Achilles heel of the entire game. Without something like a multiplayer mode or a true endgame loop, the story becomes that much more valuable in terms of the overall package, and at this point, I'm not sold. That being said, the action is spot on and easily the high point of my experience with the game, and as such, I'm really looking forward to checking out more Immortals of Aveum when the time is right. Once again, I want to thank EA and Ascendant Studios for giving our team the opportunity to check out Immortals of Aveum early. Of course, if you want more content like this in your feeds, do me a solid, hit that thumbs up, and consider subscribing. Our plan is to do a full review of the game at launch, so check back here if that's something you're interested in. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.